The mountains of Tennessee have always whispered in shadows, and the valleys carry secrets older than any grave. In the folds of the dense, mist-choked ridges, a family lived untouched by sunlight or reason, their existence folded into the black soil and the tangled roots of the forest. They were a people apart, their lives marked by strange rituals and unspoken rules, and to the few who glimpsed them, they were ghosts walking among the living. Among them was a boy grown to a man too soon, with eyes that gleamed like a predator's and a mind twisted by the silence of generations. His home was a fortress of isolation, every door a barrier, every window a frame of shadow. There, he kept his teenage sister, the last fragile branch of a lineage steeped in secrets. To the world beyond the mountains, she was ordinary, a girl with soft laughter and hair like sunlight caught in a storm, but in the heart of those dark woods, she was the object of a forbidden devotion that made the air tremble with unease. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of vanishing livestock, of shadows glimpsed in the fog, and of a family whose eyes reflected the night more than the day. Yet no one dared approach. The mountains had a way of swallowing those who strayed too close to what should have remained hidden. And inside that silent, suffocating house, love and horror had become indistinguishable, braided together like the roots beneath the floorboards. It began innocuously, a touch that lingered too long, a word too soft, a promise of protection that concealed something far darker. In the cold glow of the fireplace, the boy plotted the ultimate betrayal of blood and trust, while the girl, blissfully unaware, laughed at the simplicity of her world. The mountains waited, patient and eternal, for the secret to emerge, for the inevitability to unfold, for the darkness that had always belonged to those peaks to claim its next piece. The mountains of Tennessee rise like ancient sentinels, their jagged peaks shrouded in mist and shadow, holding secrets that have lingered for centuries. The land is remote, cut off from the flow of the outside world, a place where the sun struggles to penetrate the dense canopy of trees, and the wind whispers in hollow tones through the valleys. In these mountains, isolation is not just physical but spiritual, shaping the lives of those who inhabit them in ways both subtle and sinister. The people who call these peaks home exist almost entirely within themselves, their world defined by the contours of the land, the echo of their own voices, and the rhythms of survival in a place that refuses to yield easily to human hands. Each ridge, each crevice, seems alive, watching, holding the memory of every footstep, every whispered secret, and every betrayal that has occurred under the cover of fog and darkness. For a family like the one at the heart of this story, the mountains are both refuge and prison. They protect the inhabitants from prying eyes, from the judgment of outsiders, and from the reach of law or morality, while at the same time shaping a reality that is inward-looking, intense, and often distorted. Within this isolation, norms and boundaries blur, and the ordinary distinctions between right and wrong begin to dissolve under the pressure of constant, unbroken solitude. The family moves through their days in a rhythm dictated not by clocks but by the sun when it can be seen, by the seasons, and by the ever-present shadow of the mountains themselves. The forests are dense, the trails winding and treacherous, and the air carries a damp, earthy scent that clings to clothing and hair, mingling with the faint smell of smoke from the fireplaces that dot the secluded homesteads. Every sound is amplified in this quiet world, the snap of a twig underfoot, the distant howl of a coyote, the sighing of the wind through hollow trees, each carrying with it a sense of menace and anticipation. The mountains, while beautiful, are also unforgiving, demanding vigilance, resilience, and secrecy. In such a place, the idea of community is redefined, trust is fragile, outsiders are rare, and the family unit becomes a self-contained universe with rules, hierarchies, and codes that exist solely within its boundaries. The mountains do not merely shelter the family, they shape their thoughts, their fears, and their obsessions, cultivating an atmosphere in which darkness can take root and grow unseen, and where the line between protection and possession, love and control, can vanish as silently as the morning fog that drifts through the peaks. The family curse was whispered about in the hollows long before anyone could remember, carried on the wind like a warning no one dared fully acknowledge. It was not written in any book or spoken aloud in public, it existed in the quiet dread that seemed to settle over the household like a suffocating fog. Every generation bore its mark in subtle ways, strange births, sudden illnesses, unexplained misfortunes, but each incident was dismissed as coincidence, fate, or the harsh hand of the mountains. Yet those who lived within the walls of the old, weathered house knew the truth. The curse was real, a thread that wove through their bloodline, shaping destinies before life even began. It influenced behavior, clouded judgment, and demanded loyalty to the family above all else, fostering an insular world where morality bent under the weight of survival and secrecy. The curse was not merely a supernatural rumor but a lived reality, and it manifested in the way generations repeated the mistakes of their forebears, unable or unwilling to escape the cycles of obsession and depravity that haunted them. Children were born into its shadow, innocent yet tainted by the unspoken legacy of those who came before, and as they grew, the patterns became apparent. The men inherited dominance and a sense of entitlement over their kin, while the women inherited vulnerability and a predisposition to obedience, a balance maintained by fear, manipulation, and tradition. Every choice, every whispered conversation, and every act of intimacy was colored by the unrelenting influence of the curse. The family came to see it as inevitable, almost natural, an unbroken chain of inheritance that dictated who could love whom, who could marry, and what behaviors were permissible within the boundaries of the household. Outsiders might view such relationships with horror, but within the walls of the mountain home, they were framed as duty, necessity, or protection against the harshness of the outside world. The curse created a closed ecosystem in which secrets festered and grew, and each act of transgression or perverse devotion only reinforced its hold. The mountains themselves seemed to echo the sentiment, rising around the home as though to shield the family from intrusion, while simultaneously trapping them within their own history. The air in the house was heavy with expectation and unspoken threats, and every generation passed down its knowledge, its fears, and its obsessions as if they were sacred texts. In this way, the curse was both invisible and omnipresent, a force that dictated the contours of life in the mountains, ensuring that the sins of the past were never truly buried, and that every new life was born with the weight of inheritance pressing down on it, shaping desires, impulses, and the inevitable descent into behaviors that outsiders could never understand but that insiders had come to accept as their grim reality. The brother emerged from the shadows of the mountains as a figure both magnetic and unsettling, a man shaped by isolation and the twisted legacies of his family. From an early age, he had learned to read the subtle cues of fear and obedience, his sharp eyes noting every hesitation, every glance, every flicker of emotion that others failed to conceal. In the silence of the forested ridges and the quiet of the candlelit rooms, he honed a presence that was at once commanding and disquieting, a combination that drew people in while simultaneously making them uneasy. His movements were deliberate, calculated, as if each step through the worn wooden floors of the house, each word spoken, carried the weight of intent that could not be ignored. The isolation of the mountains had nurtured in him a keen intelligence, but one darkened by obsession and a craving for control. He understood the power of fear and affection, of subtle manipulation and overt dominance, and he wielded it with the precision of someone who had studied human weakness like a scholar examining a rare text. His charm was deceptive. To outsiders, he might appear courteous, even protective, a young man committed to his family and their survival in a harsh land, yet those who lived within the walls of the house sensed the undercurrent of menace that accompanied every gesture, every smile. He was a product of the mountains and the family curse, a man whose psyche had been shaped by generations of secrecy, deprivation, and distorted morality. The air around him seemed charged, taut with the promise of unpredictability, and even the animals in the surrounding woods responded to him with an instinctive caution, as if they, too, recognized the tension he carried. His relationship with his family was marked by a combination of loyalty and control, a web of influence that allowed him to dominate without outward confrontation, to guide without appearing coercive. And yet, beneath the surface of this calculated exterior, there was an intensity, a restless hunger, a compulsion that went beyond simple dominance or protection. It manifested in the way he observed his younger sister, in the way his attention lingered in moments meant for innocence, in the way his mind seemed always to calculate the next step, the next opportunity to exert his will. He moved through the house like a shadow cast by the mountains themselves, blending seamlessly with the gloom, yet impossible to ignore. Every thought, every action, every plan was filtered through the lens of obsession, a desire to control what was not his to control, to bend the people around him to the shape of his own dark vision, and in doing so, he became not just a man of the mountains but a force that carried the weight of history, secrecy, and something far more sinister into every corner of the isolated world he called home. The teenage sister lived her life under the heavy shadow of the mountains, her world defined by the dense forests, the narrow dirt paths, and the walls of the old family home that had known generations of whispered secrets. She moved with the innocence of youth, unaware of the darkness that thrived just beyond her sight, and her days were a delicate rhythm of chores, lessons, and fleeting moments of play within the confines of the yard and the surrounding woods. Her laughter carried like sunlight across the damp, moss-covered ground, bright and fleeting, a sharp contrast to the heavy, oppressive atmosphere that clung to the house like a second skin. She had learned to navigate the house with careful observation, noting which rooms were safe to enter, which voices to avoid, and which questions were best left unasked. Her family, bound by centuries of secrecy and twisted loyalty, had taught her obedience in subtle ways, and she obeyed without understanding why, trusting instinctively in those she depended on, even as the air around her seemed thick with unspoken tension. Her appearance, soft hair that fell in untamed waves, eyes bright with curiosity, a natural grace that made her seem almost ethereal, made her seem otherworldly against the grim, shadowed backdrop of the mountains, yet she was intimately entwined with the darkness that surrounded her. The sister's mind, though naive, was sharp and absorbing. She noticed patterns in the behavior of those around her, though she lacked the perspective to interpret them fully. Her brother's attention, intense and often suffocating, was something she neither understood nor could resist entirely, framed as care, guidance, and familial devotion. She felt the weight of his presence everywhere, in the careful tone of his words, the lingering way he watched her, and the way he seemed always to know what she was thinking before she even spoke. Friends or neighbors were few, and the outside world was a distant, almost mythical place, leaving her without perspective or refuge. The mountains insulated her from the normality of adolescence. She was denied the simple experiences that might have allowed her to recognize danger, to form independent judgment, to distinguish affection from obsession. Her innocence, vibrant and untainted in some ways, was simultaneously a vulnerability, a soft core that the environment had honed to perfection, ensuring that her life would be shaped by forces she could not yet see or resist. In every corner of the house, every shadowed room, every whispered interaction, she was enveloped by the invisible architecture of control, her daily existence structured by obedience, expectation, and the subtle, unyielding influence of a family history that demanded secrecy, silence, and compliance, leaving her unaware that the very person she trusted most could become the architect of her undoing, shaping her fate in ways she could neither predict nor escape. The brothers' obsession began quietly, almost imperceptibly, woven into the fabric of daily life until it became impossible to separate from the air she breathed. At first, it was framed as concern, a protective instinct he wielded with meticulous care, offering guidance, attention, and reassurance that seemed natural, even comforting, to a young girl growing up in the isolating mountains. He shadowed her movements through the house, monitored her interactions with the sparse neighbors, and took pains to shape her world so that it revolved around him, all while masking his intentions beneath the guise of familial loyalty. His obsession grew with each passing day, fueled by the secrecy of the mountains, the family's insular traditions, and the absence of anyone to question or challenge him. The girl, unaware of the sinister currents flowing beneath the surface, interpreted his constant attention as affection, a bond between siblings, never realizing the subtle manipulation that was eroding her autonomy and shaping her perception of normalcy. In every interaction, he planted seeds of dependence, a careful mix of flattery and coercion that made her feel both special and obligated, loved and indebted, creating an invisible tether she could not yet see. The mountains themselves seemed to conspire with him, isolating her from outside influence, amplifying his control, and masking the moral corruption that had begun to seep into their relationship. His obsession was methodical. He studied her routines, her thoughts, and her weaknesses, and he adapted his behavior to tighten his influence without raising suspicion. Every smile, every touch, every whispered word was a calculated instrument, bending her will incrementally, while he maintained the pretense of care and guidance. The subtlety of his control was its most insidious aspect, for it allowed him to normalize his presence in her life to the point where she could not imagine her existence without him. Her trust became a weapon in his hands, her innocence a tool to be molded. As the obsession deepened, his thoughts grew darker, shifting from possessiveness to a desire to fully dominate, to claim what should have been forbidden, and to ensure that no force outside the mountains could interfere. The psychological grip he exercised was nearly invisible, entwined with love, fear, and loyalty, and it left her unprepared for the step he had been planning for years, the moment when protection would morph into possession, when affection would become a cage, and when the brothers' obsession would cross the ultimate boundary, transforming from a shadowy influence into an undeniable, irreversible act that would seal both of their fates in a web spun long before they were capable of understanding its full reach. The surrounding community, scattered across the foothills and hollows of the mountains, existed in a delicate balance between curiosity, fear, and deliberate ignorance. Life outside the family home carried its own hardships, yet those who lived near the isolated ridges had long learned that some things were better left unspoken, some doors better left unopened, and some families better left untouched. The household in question had always been different, its presence marked by strange lights in the windows at odd hours, the distant echo of voices carried across the wind, and occasional glimpses of figures moving silently through the fog that clung to the forest. Stories circulated quietly in taverns, at church gatherings, and along the narrow dirt paths, whispered tales of oddities and misfortunes, yet no one dared investigate. Fear, born of the mountain's oppressive isolation and the family's reputation, kept neighbors at a cautious distance. They might glance toward the house when passing, but the curiosity that stirred was tempered by instinct and unspoken rules of self-preservation. Outsiders who strayed too close risked confrontation, ridicule, or worse, being drawn into a world they could not fully comprehend. In this vacuum of oversight, the family thrived in secrecy, their rituals and obsessions shielded by the thick forests and the complicity of silence. Strange incidents began to accumulate around the house and the surrounding woods, small at first, almost dismissible, but each one leaving a residue of unease that settled heavily over the family and anyone who glimpsed their world. Livestock vanished without explanation, the neighbors whispered of shadows glimpsed moving against the trees, and the occasional distant scream or wail pierced the fog-laden valleys, carried by the wind like a warning no one wanted to heed. Doors would creak open on their own in the dead of night, and the flicker of candlelight would reveal fleeting shapes that seemed to vanish when looked at directly. Objects moved subtly, rearranged in ways that suggested presence where no one should have been, while footsteps echoed through empty hallways, heavy and deliberate, yet impossible to trace. The forest seemed to participate in these disturbances, each gust of wind through the skeletal branches sounding like whispers, and every rustle of leaves a potential harbinger of danger. These occurrences were not immediately alarming to outsiders who might happen to catch a glimpse, because they could be explained as the tricks of wind, shadow, or imagination, but for the family, they were constant reminders of the fragile boundary between their insular world and forces beyond comprehension or control. The brother watched these incidents with a calculating eye, noting how they influenced the sister, how they shaped her perception of the world as unpredictable, fragile, and dependent on his guidance. The disturbances worked to tighten his influence, making the forest, the house, and even the eerie whispers of the mountains seem alive with unseen threats that only he could protect her from. In the surrounding community, tales of the strange events spread quietly, punctuated by fear and speculation, yet no one dared intervene directly, and over time, people came to accept them as part of the natural oddity of the mountains. The sister, too, began to notice things, small anomalies that prickled her senses, though she could not name them or understand their significance. Shadows seemed to follow her, doors clicked closed after she passed, and the animals of the woods appeared unusually alert, their instincts keyed to a danger she could not yet perceive. Each of these disturbances, minor on its own, built upon the last, creating a cumulative tension that thickened the air, influencing behavior, shaping decisions, and escalating the sense of suspense and dread. The mountains themselves seemed complicit, their fog and terrain amplifying the strangeness, folding the family into an ever-tightening web of isolation and fear, while the line between natural events and the deliberate acts of the brother blurred. In this atmosphere, trust, perception, and reality became malleable, each odd incident bending the sister's understanding of safety, drawing her deeper into a world where manipulation and horror could grow unchecked, setting the stage for the inevitable crossing of boundaries that had always lingered just out of sight, waiting to emerge from the shadows. The marriage pact was not announced with fanfare or ceremony, it emerged quietly, as if it had always existed in the shadows of the house, an inevitability shaped by years of manipulation, secrecy, and isolation. The brother had orchestrated every detail with careful precision, ensuring that the moment would arrive without resistance, without scrutiny, and without interruption from the outside world. To the sister, it seemed a sudden shift in the natural course of her life, framed as protection, stability, and the fulfillment of family duty, but beneath the surface, it was the culmination of a psychological pattern that had been meticulously constructed over years. Every act, every word, every gesture from him had led to this point, subtly conditioning her to trust, to obey, and to see him as the center of her small, enclosed universe. In a household where the mountains insulated them from outsiders, where neighbors' eyes were averted and curiosity suppressed, he could bend circumstances to his will. He controlled the timing, the narrative, and the perception, creating a version of reality in which her consent seemed natural, even inevitable, and in which the notion of resistance had never existed. The rituals and conversations that led to the pact were framed as familial tradition, as if joining hands in this way preserved the family's survival in a harsh and unforgiving environment. The outside world, distant and intimidating, carried no weight, no law, no moral judgment, and no intervention could penetrate the mountain's protective barrier. In this carefully constructed ecosystem, the brother's obsession transformed into action, and the line between protection and possession dissolved completely. He leveraged the community's indifference, the sister's innocence, and the constant psychological conditioning to seal the pact without confrontation, without argument, and without immediate recognition of the horror by the one who was most affected. The mountains, ever watchful, seemed to hold their breath as the boundary was crossed, the air thick with inevitability, the forests silent witnesses to a union that defied natural law and human morality. Each step toward the marriage pact reinforced the power dynamics the brother had cultivated, ensuring that she would be unable to see any alternative, any escape, any challenge to his control. The pact itself, though secret, carried enormous consequences. It codified the brother's dominance, institutionalized his influence, and transformed what had been obsession into permanence. Within the house, the walls seemed to close in, the shadows lengthened, and the very atmosphere of the mountains became a part of the scheme, an accomplice in the act. To the sister, it may have seemed like a strange but protective arrangement. To the brother, it was the ultimate triumph of manipulation and desire. The pact blurred the line between care and coercion, loyalty and control, innocence and violation, setting the stage for a life bound by the oppressive intimacy of the mountains, where family and obsession intertwined so tightly that they could no longer be separated, and where the consequences would ripple through every corner of their secluded, shadowed existence. The threat of discovery loomed over the family like a storm cloud that could break at any moment, an invisible pressure that sharpened the tension within the house and the surrounding mountains. 4 years, the brother had operated in careful secrecy, ensuring that every action, every word, and every interaction with his sister was controlled, monitored, and insulated from the outside world. But even the most meticulously maintained secrecy carries the risk of exposure, and in the hollows of Tennessee, whispers traveled through the sparse network of neighbors, carried by curiosity, suspicion, and the occasional careless comment. A single visitor, a wandering hunter, or a distant relative could inadvertently stumble upon the family's carefully constructed reality, and the consequences would be catastrophic. The brother, ever vigilant, understood this danger better than anyone, and he orchestrated his behavior with precision to minimize even the faintest risk. He observed the movements of outsiders, gauged their reactions, and adjusted his demeanor to project normalcy while concealing the darker currents that defined the household. Still, the threat of discovery was not only external. The sister herself, increasingly aware of oddities in behavior, patterns of control, and inconsistencies in explanations, began to perceive the subtle distortions of her world. Her growing awareness, though incomplete, represented a fragile crack in the brother's control, a potential spark that could ignite exposure. Every conversation, every glance, every act of manipulation became a delicate balance, a dance along a razor's edge where misstep could unravel years of secrecy. The mountains, once a protective barrier, now heightened the stakes. The isolation that had allowed the family to operate undisturbed also magnified the impact of any potential exposure, making the consequences of discovery all the more immediate and absolute. Fear of judgment, punishment, or legal intervention hovered over every interaction, pressing the brother to maintain vigilance and to anticipate threats that had yet to materialize. Even the community's indifference was a fragile shield, one that could fracture under the wrong circumstances, revealing the hidden truth and forcing confrontation with a world that would neither forgive nor forget. The tension infiltrated the atmosphere of the house, thickening the air, influencing behavior, and heightening every sense, as if the walls themselves were aware of the risk and whispered warnings to those within. In this environment, every choice carried weight, every miscalculation carried risk, and every lapse could expose not only the brothers' obsession but also the intricate web of secrecy, manipulation, and control that had defined the family for generations. The threat of discovery was a silent predator, stalking the household, shaping actions and reactions, and ensuring that the shadow of exposure hung perpetually over their lives, a constant reminder that even in the seclusion of the mountains, the dark deeds of the past and present could not remain hidden forever. The mountains themselves seemed to hold their breath, as if aware of the darkness that had taken root within their folds, and within that quiet, oppressive landscape, the family's secrets were never fully contained. The brothers' actions, though hidden from the world beyond the ridges, were only one thread in a tapestry woven over generations, a pattern of obsession, control, and twisted loyalty that had been repeated and refined with meticulous precision. Each act of manipulation, each boundary crossed, each violation of trust was not an isolated event but part of a lineage of behaviors passed down, reinforced by isolation and the insularity of the household. The sister, now bound by the marriage pact and the relentless psychological grip her brother had cultivated, was caught in a web far larger than her comprehension, a web that extended beyond her immediate surroundings to encompass the family's history, the legacy of the mountains, and the unspoken rules that governed every action within those shadowed walls. Even as the outside world remained at bay, the consequences of living within this closed ecosystem were inescapable, shaping thoughts, desires, and perceptions in ways both subtle and profound. Every corner of the house seemed to whisper reminders of the family's past transgressions, every shadow in the woods reflected the weight of inherited darkness, and the very air carried the scent of inevitability. The mountains, in their eternal presence, acted as both shield and witness, absorbing the echoes of generations of secrecy while amplifying the intensity of isolation, ensuring that the patterns of obsession and control would continue unchecked. The brothers' influence extended beyond mere manipulation. It became a force that reshaped the reality of the household, bending morality, loyalty, and desire to the contours of his will. The sister, despite flashes of awareness or resistance, found herself enmeshed in a system that had been honed over decades, a system designed to obscure, normalize, and perpetuate acts that would horrify any outsider. Within this universe, the notion of choice was fragile, the perception of freedom a fragile illusion maintained only by the careful orchestration of attention, affection, and intimidation. And yet, there was a sense that even this darkness was only a fragment of what the mountains had witnessed, a single story among countless others buried in the fog, hidden by the terrain and the complicity of isolation. The peaks and valleys held histories of obsession, betrayal, and unspoken acts, a repository of secrets that had shaped the people who lived there in ways both visible and invisible. In this context, the brothers' story was not merely an aberration but part of a continuum, a reminder that in the remote folds of the mountains, human desire, fear, and cruelty could fester unchecked, and that the legacy of secrecy and manipulation was never contained, never finite, and always capable of reaching further, shaping lives and destinies long after any single act had passed into shadow.